Now this takes me to India. I've given a sort of a background on America, but what does it mean for India? The China threat and the Islam threat have challenged America, challenged from both sides. But from within, it has this grand narrative of manifest destiny, a great nation that should remain great, will remain great, and so on. So people have been promised, kids have been raised with certain textbooks and certain education to expect something as Americans when they grow up. But the reality in the outside world is threatening that American dream. So there's anxieties, and this is the mindset with which America approaches India. So there is a view that says let's build up India, and there's a view that says let's fragment India. The build up India says it will be counter to China's hegemony, containment of Islamic threat, immediate Western corporate interests, stabilizing influence and role model in the third world. Of course, problem is that if India is very successful, it will be a competitor to Western economy long term, so we'll end up creating another China. If we build up India, short term and medium term, it's very good for all these reasons. But in the long run, it will be another billion-person strong competitor that will come after us in economic terms. So there's another belief that says fragment India, divide and rule discourse, very common in social studies about India, South Asian studies. Dalits versus Brahmins, Dravidians versus so-called Aryans, women versus men, minorities versus Hindus. Fragment, fragment, fragment. Conflict, conflict, conflict. Benefits to the West, avoids a China-like competitor. 1 billion contained laborers, so you can harvest labor, but they will never be very strong at par with you. Accelerate the evangelism, and a good market for weapons, because you can sell the Gujarat army tanks to fight the Maharashtra army, or you could sell Andhra Air Force missiles to fight some other one. So fragmented, broken up would be good for the weapons industry. Problem is it would lead to chaos. If it became fragmented far too much, it may Talibanize, or it may fall in the hands of the other side in the clash of civilizations. So America wouldn't want India to fall apart either, and it wouldn't want India to become like another China-like strong nation either. So I call this the mother-in-law syndrome. The mother-in-law doesn't want the couple to become too strong and empowered and successful and together, because she feels threatened that she's not needed. So she wants to meddle, and she wants to meddle in different ways, some above board, some not so above board, tell one person about the other, always have some dirty secret about each one to keep them honest, and all sorts of things, all sorts of games to keep her empowered. On the other hand, if the couple is falling apart, if there's too much fragmentation and there's going to be chaos, there's going to be no stable, unified home, she's threatened by that also. So she's threatened by either of the two extremes. And so with one hand, she's stabilizing them, making them strong and encouraging them and keeping them together. And with the other hand, she's also undermining them to make sure there's business for her to stay there. So this is sort of the American dilemma and conflict in dealing with India like a mother-in-law. So since we're all good at understanding the mother-in-law, we're all very qualified to understand America. Now, to give you an example that this is not just theory, it can be very serious stuff. There is something called the Afro-Dalit Project. You go online and you do a search on Afro-Dalit Project, you'll get some hits. This project has a thesis which says the Dalits are the blacks of India, non-Dalits are the whites of India, and history of American slavery is the framework to understand Dalits' current problems. Institutional support comes from Western churches, South Asian academic studies, human rights groups. Activities include building an Indian franchise network to promote this, India-based seminars and training of Dalit activists, and then there is something called the Dalitistan Project. I didn't know about this until a woman who's an African-American scholar at Princeton University who was helping me with understanding American culture, deep culture and all that. She introduced me to another African colleague of hers who does black studies. And in that dinner discussion, this other gentleman said, he's just come back from India, So I said, well, what were you doing there? He said, oh, I'm part of this Dalit empowerment project, and our role is to have this African Dalit brotherhood that, our experience as blacks in America is the framing in which we can help them understand their experience in India. So there's a tutoring project funded quite systematically that I accidentally ran across. And then I also found that there are these maps on fragmenting India that you see in some of these places, which talk about a Dalitistan, there is a Dravidianistan, there is a Shudrastan, there is this Mughalistan, and stuff like that. Now some of this may seem like a joke, but remember that Pakistan, the first time ever the word Pakistan was mentioned was a kind of a resolution in Cambridge in the 1920s, 1930s by a few students there who actually came up with this acronym, and it was taken as a joke and not treated very seriously. Also, a large part of the intellectual incubation of the Naxalite movement happened in MIT back in the 60s. So these are things that on a long-term basis have some effect. Now, I have a provocation about what's happening to minorities. They are minorities in a local context, but in a global context, they may have, in some cases, not most and not all certainly, but in many cases, they may have been like a corporate takeover of a local company. Many of them have been appropriated by global forces. So what I see here is more nationalism in the Western world. I'm just talking about America because I've studied it more closely, but there's more nationalism in France, in China, in Russia, in Japan, in Arab countries, and so on. But there is a trend of deconstruction of India as a nation state. Tomorrow's lecture I'll go very deep into what that is, what is happening in some major academic institutions in America with respect to that. I'll give you examples, I'll tell you a lot more about that. However, sub-nations, which are all those different Dalitistan and the Kashmir separatism and Northeast separatism and all those, they are being encouraged. So identity is considered a good thing when it's for a fragment. It's considered a bad thing when it's for India on the whole. So my question is, could the third world minorities end up as unwitting agents for imperialism and as the new global coolies? And there is no isolated or local context. So today, when you say so-and-so is a minority, you have to ask in a global context, are they part of a power structure which is globally not a minority? It's like, the analogy I would give you is, if there is a McDonald's restaurant with 20 employees run by minorities they've hired, you will quickly say it's not really a minority establishment, because if you look at them in isolation, it's a minority. But if you look at where the money comes from, who they report to, what global structure they're part of, it's a local agent or a local branch office of a mighty multinational. The same can also be said of non-business entities, of NGOs, of religious groups, of various other kinds of identities that are now part of and being managed by global configurations. So the question is, can there be a deconstruction that leads to another kind of a balkanization? So question I ask here is, are Indians managed by Americans? The businesses are investing in India, subsidiaries, joint ventures, supplier, customer, but this is very above board. This is very above board, and Indians are very good at getting back as equals. They're doing very well. They will do very well. I consider the left column to be very promising for Indians. It may start with the arrow going down, but I think the arrow is also beginning to go up, and so it's kind of becoming equal, and Indians may end up having an upper hand with some advantages. I'm not so sure with the rest of it. I see a very tight involvement between government and academy, government and churches, churches and academy, and all funding mechanisms that all of them put together. And then these funding mechanisms work their way into India. They fund academic, journalists, funding agencies, and the churches have subsidiaries. Churches are like multinationals, they have their subsidiaries, and then there are these NGOs that work in various mysterious ways. So a study of this area which is a complex infusion of funds and influence and ideologies from the upper side of the diagram to the lower side, from America to India, I think is something that hasn't been done. In fact, I'm surprised that I couldn't find a single report on this kind of a mechanism. There's huge amounts of monies that have come, but a report which analyzes who, why, what have they done, what is it all about, what are the implications. I just couldn't find anybody in India who's done this.
Some estimate of the money that has come in
India. Yeah, I'll give that tomorrow. Yeah, I'll give those things tomorrow. General observations: Indian government is missing in action. I don't see them being a factor. Certainly the US government is involved, but Indian government is sort of more at the receiving end. There's enormous interactions among the American parties. I listed all those American parties. They're tightly involved. They have a flow of experts going back and forth. They have group meetings. They sponsor things together. They're known to each other. They're friends. Many Indians are led by Western influences in this vacuum of Indian grand narrative hurts, because the moment you counter, they say, which Indian? What Indian do you talk about? You talk about one kind of Indian, but I can tell you 5 other kinds. You represent this grand narrative, but this grand narrative, the other guy is opposed. So they're very good at coming back to make sure there's nothing defensible about India, because they'll say, which India? An equivalent mapping of China would be dramatically different. You just don't have that kind of a diagram in the case of China, because China just won't let that happen. China is more in control of China's studies, China's own NGOs, China's own underbelly, and it's closed, for better or worse, it's closed to outside influence. Now, America's complex interests in India, I've broken down business interests, church interests, government interests, academic interests. And then what interest about 3 issues: sovereignty of India, Indian civilization, and Hinduism. Now, the last column is controversial when you talk to Indians. It's not controversial when you talk to Americans, because in their way of studying India, it's a very important aspect of studying India. So whatever you may think of your relationship with Hinduism, you may think you have none, you don't care, it's private, we're secular, it doesn't matter. The American, when he sees you and says finds out that you're an Indian, in his mind, his images of India and Hinduism are all mixed up. They're all mixed up. Unless the person is a very major scholar and knows a lot. The average American, serious American, in terms of policy making, a serious intellectual, a businessman, cannot leave Hinduism out when he's trying to understand you as an Indian. So it is important, therefore, to see what their postures are. Now, the sovereignty of India. See, if you look across, businesses want stability of India, except maybe the weapons industry. I mean, they could sell more weapons if it were not stable. But certainly Microsoft and Coca-Cola and IBM, Citibank, they want a stable market. They want stable supply lines. They don't want fragmentation because it's bad business. And they're very practical. Green, by the way, in this chart is positive. Gray is negative, and this murky brown background is sort of mixed up, partly positive, partly negative. So the business also, in terms of their attitude towards Indian civilization, you see positive in the way they advertise and they respect Indian civilization. Also, it's good for their labor relations. They don't want to, they know they're hiring a lot of Indian people, both in India and in the United States. The attitude towards Hinduism is to be politically correct and distant, and to reflect labor relations. So I think businesses overall are not trying to subvert any of this, because they're looking to just make money. I mean, they're very straightforward about it. Church, there's a PR. PR says India's sovereignty, yeah, we're very positive, it's a good thing. But in practice, Billy Graham's autobiography says that one of the things he's very sad about is that he's been unable to have a separatist, to have a Nagaland separate, as one example. I mean, that's written in there. So that's the practice, no matter what the PR says. The attitude towards Indian civilization is that, yes, we like the secularism, but in practice also there is identity engineering which makes people have doubts about Indian identity and Indian history and the ability of Indian civilization to deliver the goods. The attitude towards Hinduism is that Hinduism is same as Hindutva, which is measured based on current politics. So whether you like it or not, whether you as a Hindu are believing in Hindutva or you don't believe in Hindutva or you're even anti-Hindutva, doesn't matter. They will shape you as though you are part of whatever is going on in current politics. And the practice is to study caste, dowry, sati, gender, that sort of, as a characterization of what Hinduism is all about. Government, PR, we are positive and allies. That's the PR. Practice, I think long-term options are open. I don't think there's anything very long-term in strategic alliances from the US. It's a short-term horizon. Human rights, Indian civilization, it says, well, we're interested in human rights. It's a very positive thing. We want your human rights. We're here to help you. In practice, there's a desire to Americanize the culture as much as possible. The position towards Hinduism is it's a politically correct distance. So I don't think that it officially wants to take a stand on Hinduism. But in practice, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom in Washington, D.C. has regular hearings where very, very often it is a charge against Hindu groups doing something wrong. Christians are victims, somebody else is a victim. But hardly ever the other way around. It seems like Hindus are kind of monopolizing bad behavior, if you looked at the hearings of those commissions. The academic humanities, public relations about India is couched in terms like self-determination. That's a very positive way to say fragmentation. But in practice, it really means fragmentation. Indian civilization, the academics have a very romantic and exotic view. But in the actual work, if you look at what it amounts to, it's often delegitimizing Indian civilization. And the view on Hinduism, both openly and in practice, says Hinduism equals Hindutva equals fascism. It may not be said in so many words, although some scholars have said it in so many words. More typically, two of the three will be equated. So either a given scholar will say Hinduism is Hindutva, and then he'll stop at that. And his colleague, three offices down the hall, will say Hindutva is fascism, and he'll stop at that. But equating all three very openly is not often done, although that's what students